Thinking is hard work, as we know, and teaching students to think is also hard work, but the benefits are there for all. Firstly, if the students can think better and develop good competence in thinking, they will learn better, and if they learn better, it makes our job easier. In this short video, we're going to look at 4 very important general instructional principles. Obviously, they're all connected together. So let's, on this first slide, our advanced organizer, identify them and make sure we're all clear. Firstly, as in any type of learning, students must know how to do it and understand how it works. Then through deliberate practice, they get better. So we must teach what is good thinking. We must identify and clarify with students that there is critical thinking, creative thinking, metacognitive thinking, and also what are the mental operations, the cognitive operations for each type of thinking. Remember the model of thinking I presented earlier. And we do this through direct instruction, demonstration, getting students to do it and giving them feedback. And it's important to use the language of thinking. What that means quite simply is that we don't say to students, well, comment on this. What do you think? We ask them to say, right, analyze this. Compare and contrast these options. Looking at this data, what inference and interpretations you make. You make thinking visible. We will be going through that in the next couple of slides. The second big principle, and obviously related, is to use structured questions to direct and reinforce the types of thinking. As I mentioned, let's compare and contrast these 2 diets, for example, as opposed to say, well, comment on these diets. The students might say, oh, well, the diets look pretty attractive. Remember, we must try to get students to learn what we want them to learn, and that will be done through specific questions where students focus their mind on particular types of information in particular ways. Again, there's nothing wrong in getting students to learn factual content knowledge. We know that is fundamentally bound up with good thinking. But what we want to do is to give students tasks that connect the content knowledge to types of thinking, and that's how we build understanding. Remember, information from the environment combining with information that's already in long-term memory. And this goes on in working memory. So if we give students real-world tasks that necessitate the different types of thinking we want to develop, they will be cognitively building understanding, we say hopefully, in their working memory in relation to crunching up this information, building better mental representations in long-term memory. And finally, it's not just about cognition, that we've got to get students to persevere and to put the necessary effort in. As we know, thinking is hard work, and it will require students to persevere and develop the capability to look for detail, to listen well. And as we know, humour helps most instructional strategies. You can look at the old slide here, and it's an example of using the language of thinking. As we said, let's cue the types of thinking we want and provide structure to the thinking process. To ask students to comment on 2 proposed solutions for anything could lead students to go anywhere. They might just say, oh, well, that one looks prettier than this one, or oh, I like this one because it reminds me of my next door neighbour's dog. Well, that's not terribly important. What we want students to do is to compare and contrast, identify similarities and differences, and then be able to apply that understanding across different decision-making situations, which will take them into evaluation. Important point there in blue at the bottom, contextualize it to the student group. What I've written there would probably work pretty well in secondary education where students understand the language I'm using, but you might use more simple language with younger learner groups. Making student thinking visible, fundamental. It's pure activation of prior knowledge. If we don't hear and we don't see what students are doing so we can infer how they're thinking, we can't then bridge the gaps. And the gaps could be knowledge gaps, process gaps. In other words, students simply haven't taken on board what the different types of thinking are and haven't sufficiently got comfortable with the cognitive heuristics of each type of thinking. So what we're doing is diagnosing their existing knowledge and to fill those knowledge gaps with good feedback, task, process feedback, and perhaps even managing themselves so they persevere. I think that's very clear, but do digest that slide. You can download it, but we must do this well. And equally, make our own good thinking visible. We are supposedly the experts. We know how to do these intellectual processes we call thinking, so we need to make it visible. We can actually vocalize how we're going about using these different types of thinking in situations. Quite simply, we can't assume that students know how to do this, and the evidence clearly shows that many don't, and those that do have often learned it through trial and error and maybe not be able to articulate it. So that's the fundamental thing about teaching good thinking. Questions, as we say, are immensely powerful. You can look at the quotes there, and asking good questions, the what and how questions, cueing the different types of thinking, that's how we do this. Here's just one example. I've taken an area that probably we're all familiar with to some extent, an area to do with health education. If you look at those questions, you can see exactly where the thinking is being directed. We're getting students to look at similarities and differences between two types of virus. What's significant and what's different about the those two viruses, and what's the significance of this? And then we might want students to be building up a bigger picture of understanding. So we say, well, what inference interpretations can we draw from some data on HIV infection in Asia? That's just an example, but you can see we are trying to get students to analyze, to compare and contrast, and to make inferences and interpretations. And further down the line, we might want them to consider different options. So we would get them to say, well, how would we evaluate the effectiveness of an HIV prevention program? What would be a criteria? Would it be the number of people who do this or do that? And also to see how HIV is not just a medical issue, but is related to belief systems and sanitation and things like that. So what's the relationship between HIV infection and poverty? And we might want to start student off in some kind of creative process in terms of they come up with new ideas. What other ways might we make people more aware of HIV infection? That format there can be used in any subject area, obviously contextualized to the subject content. So I hope you've been able to stay with all this, but this is the real meaty key concept stuff.